introduction because you all know by now who I am. My name is Casey Watson. I'm the outreach worker here at Murray Street. It has been said many times, and I'm sure we've all heard it, it's been said by wise men and women everywhere, that there are at least two topics of conversation that one should avoid in mixed company: religion and politics. And so I suppose we should call ourselves, we'll call ourselves brave tonight. For here, 3 days before the American election, in a church, going to hear a talk about President Lincoln and his connection to a young soldier. Speaking of wise men, my pleasure is to introduce my father, who is the speaker for tonight. So Dad, thank you for coming, and I look forward to hearing your talks.
Okay, thank you, Casey. I was undecided what to share with you tonight. I emailed Casey which topic it should be, Lincoln or another topic I named. And his return email had one word, Lincoln. So Lincoln it is. Sometimes his emails are actually 2 or 3 times as long as that. The private and the president. Promises kept. There had been a long march, and that night 21-year-old Private William Scott from a Vermont farm had stood watch. The next day there was another long march, and again he stood watch, this time volunteering for a sick comrade. It was too much. He was too tired. He was found sleeping at his post. The Union Army was at Chain Bridge, connecting Virginia with Washington, D.C., a critically important location. Discipline must be kept. William Scott was apprehended, charged, tried by court-martial, convicted, and sentenced to be executed. William Scott was a prisoner in his tent, awaiting the fateful next morning. The flaps of his tent parted, and towering before him was his commander-in-chief, President Abraham Lincoln. William said, "I knew him at once by a Lincoln medal I had long worn. I was scared at first before I talked with an important man. But Mr. Lincoln was so easy with me, so gentle, that I soon forgot my fright. He asked me all about the people at home, the neighbors, the farm, and where I went to school, who my schoolmates were. Then he asked me about my mother, and I was glad I could, and how she looked, and I was glad I could take out a picture and show him. He said how thankful I ought to be that my mother was still alive. And he said that if he were in my place, he would try to make her a proud mother and never cause her a sorrow or a tear. At 11 or 12, Abraham had lost his mother." Then William continues, "He had said nothing yet about that dreadful next morning. I thought it must be that he was so kind-hearted he didn't want to talk about it. But why did he say so much about my mother when I must die the next morning? But I suppose that was something that would have to go unexplained. So I thought I would brace up and ask him a favor. Wouldn't he fix it so that the firing squad wouldn't be from our regiment? That was going to be the hardest of all, to die by the hands of my comrades. Just as I was going to ask him this favor, he stood up and he says, 'My boy, stand up here and look me in the face.' I did as he bade me. 'My boy,' he said, 'you are not going to be shot tomorrow. I believe you when you tell me you couldn't keep awake. I am going to trust you and send you back to your regiment.'" Near the end of the conversation, William continues, "Then Mr. Lincoln put his hands on my shoulders and looked me in the face, as if he was sorry, and said, 'If from this day William Scott does his duty, so that if I was there when he comes to die, he can look me in the face as he does now and tell me that he has done his duty as a soldier, then my debt will be paid. Will you make that promise and try to keep it?' The promise was made. Thenceforward, there never was such a soldier as William Scott. Francis de Haes Janvier wrote a long narrative poem titled The Sleeping Sentinel. One verse referring to Lincoln goes something like this. Then suddenly was heard the noise of steeds and wheels approach, and rolling through a cloud of dust appeared a stately coach. The woes of 30 millions filled his burdened heart with grief. Embattled hosts on land and sea acknowledged him their chief. And yet amid the din of war, he heard the plaintive cry of that poor soldier as he lay in prison doomed to die. In his book, 3 Years in the Sixth Corps, written right after the Civil War, Dr. George Stevens, a surgeon assigned to the 77th New York Regiment, describes the joy the pardon gave the troops and the inspiration it gave the nation. It was in the newspapers. The president was a hero to the common soldier and a leader to be trusted. Over the course of the war, Lincoln personally considered numerous appeals for pardon. Scholars have said that he was most lenient with the young and with those who fell asleep on duty. He said he always asked whether he believed the soldier would likely help the nation more when dead or if allowed to live. One time he interrupted a cabinet meeting to hear a sad woman's story. She came back to see him at an appointed time, but there was no reply to her knock. The door being ajar, she opened it a little more and saw the president at his desk, slumped over, asleep, his head on his hands, on his arms. Beside him on the desk was the signed pardon for her son. She gently woke him and blessed him for his mercy. Another memorable case was that of a heartbroken old man whose son was waiting execution and who had spent several days in Washington before someone finally led him to the president. He told a story. The president listened intently. Then he filled out a paper and handed it to the man to read. Do not execute, and he filled in the name of the young soldier, until you have received orders from me, signed Abraham Lincoln. The man started walking away slowly, head bowed. And then, with tears running down his face, he turned back toward the president, who was watching him, and pleaded, and I'm paraphrasing, but this doesn't say my son is pardoned, only that his death sentence is delayed. Lincoln replied, you must not know my character. Go along in peace, old man. Before I order him to be shot, your son will be older than Methuselah. William Scott's father later personally thanked President Lincoln. The president allowed Thomas Scott to visit his sons with the Army in Virginia. Lincoln is reported to have given Mr. Scott a $10 bill after he asked him how he could manage his farm with his 5 sons at war. The end came for William Scott 7 months later, during one of those awful battles. He said, you all know what you can tell them at home about me. I have tried to do the right thing. And if any of you ever have the chance, I wish you would tell President Lincoln that I've never forgotten the kind words he said to me at the Chain Bridge. And that now, when I know that I am dying, I think of his kind face and I thank him again. If they did tell the president, I believe that he who had already lost 2 of his own 4 boys and would lose a 3rd would have been visibly moved. On that same day that William Scott was mortally wounded, April the 16th, 1862, Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Act, freeing the slaves in the District of Columbia. 8.5 months later, he would sign the Emancipation Proclamation, freeing the slaves in the states that had seceded. and again in December 1865, following his death, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution made slavery illegal in the whole country. He had once said, "When I hear someone arguing for slavery, I feel a strong impulse to see it tried on him personally." Another time he said, "Although volume upon volume is written to prove slavery a very good thing, we never hear of a man who wishes to take the good of it by being slave himself." But Lincoln freed not only the slaves. In the Battle of Gettysburg, or Pickett's Charge as it was also called, George Pickett was the Confederate general. After the Civil War, if there is such a thing, LaSalle Pickett, his wife, had a baby in her arms when she answered a knock at the door. "I opened the door," she recounted, "and looked up at a tall, gaunt, sad-faced man in ill-fitting clothes. To her astonishment, the visitor announced he was Abraham Lincoln." "Abraham Lincoln, the president?" she gasped. "No, Abraham Lincoln, George's old friend." Then, kissing George Jr., he said, "Tell your father, the rascal, that for the sake of your bright eyes, I forgive him." Reminds me of the words of an itinerant speaker in Palestine. "You have heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say, love your enemies." After the Civil War, when the South was on its knees, cabinet ministers were saying, "Why don't you take advantage of the situation and destroy your enemies?" Lincoln said, "Do I not destroy my enemies when I make them my friends?" When they asked him how to treat the former enemies who were still alive, Lincoln said, "Let them up easy." Shakespeare, one he had read extensively, said, "The quality of mercy is not strained. It droppeth as the gentle rain from heaven upon the place beneath. It is twice blessed. It blesseth him that gives and him that takes." Lincoln was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and people hid, as it were, their faces from him. No stranger to depression, he once said, "If what I feel were distributed to the whole human family, there would be not one cheerful face on earth. Whether I shall ever be better, I cannot tell. I awfully forebode that I shall not. To remain as I am is impossible. I must die or be better, it appears to me." It seems Lincoln learned the secret cure when he read the book of Job. You remember Job's depression, how he had lost his business, his family, and his health? We all recall the patience of Job, but do we recall how he was released from his prison of depression? It's in a little verse right near the end of the book. "And God turned the captivity of Job when he prayed for his friends, when he got his eyes off himself and onto the needs of others." The scriptures of all religions convey this same importance of concern for others. The New Testament says, "Confess your faults and pray for each other so that you will be healed." In his life and in his nation, Lincoln faced horrendous hardship. His first love died of typhoid fever prior to their marriage date. His next girlfriend turned his proposal down. The woman he married after an 18-month break in the engagement, perhaps an indication of his doubt, was from a slave-owning family in Kentucky, and according to most of the reports, a judgmental, high-maintenance spendthrift. Yet in spite of the hardship, or maybe because of it, Lincoln always had a joke or funny story on his mind. When you have got an elephant by the hind leg and he's trying to run away, it is best to let him go. If all the people who fall asleep in church were laid out end to end, they'd be a lot more comfortable. He told a story about two Quaker women discussing who would win the war, whether Jefferson Davis, the president of the secessionist states, or Lincoln. One said, I think Jefferson Davis because he's a praying man. The other said, well, Mr. Lincoln's a praying man too. The other said, yes, but God will think Abraham is joking. He once said, I am not so much concerned if God is on my side as I am in being sure that I am on God's side. He made himself the butt of most of his stories. He was so fond of the letters of the humorist Petroleum V. Nasby that he wrote a letter to Nasby praising him for his ability to make people laugh and suggesting they change jobs. 3 jobs. Some church people would tell Lincoln that all that mattered was that he believed correctly. His reply, when I do good, I feel good. When I do bad, I feel bad. That's my religion. And don't we all know deep down that whatever we believe or say we believe, what matters is what we do? Why call you me Lord, Lord, and do not the things that I say? And doesn't our experience teach us that how we feel depends on what we do? My father used to hang his overalls on a hook on the wall downstairs before he went upstairs to bed. He used to carry his money loose in a front pocket. Once when I was a teenager, I stole some change from those overalls. Those of you who have heard many of my speeches may consider this a relatively minor one of my many misdeeds. When my dad questioned me the next day, I denied it. It wasn't until probably 30 years later, when he was living in my house, because his house had burned down, that I told him how sorry I was for the way I had treated him over the years. His reply, combination of forgiveness and confession, caught me off guard and helped me breathe easier. He said, it works both ways, Murray. For someone who, like myself, found it hard to talk about one's own faults, he had, to use one of his own phrases, said a mouthful. Lincoln did not bow at the altar of conformity. He had learned obedience by the things he had suffered. Obedience not to any external authority, but to the still small voice, the gentle whisper in the mind. In his words, the angels of our better nature. He wasn't born on third base, but he cared about neither personal poverty nor riches, about neither praise nor blame, but only in his words, to do the right as God gives us to see the right. In his second inaugural address, he used a phrase which marked both his political and personal life. With malice towards none, with charity for all. For he believed in an unseen court, more supreme than the Supreme Court of his country, in an unseen law, more unchanging than the Constitution of his country, in an unseen light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. Of his first cabinet, once all rivals of his, he said, when I looked around and saw they were the best, I didn't think it fair to deprive the country of their services. He never tried to defeat an individual, but only prejudice. With only a year and a half of elementary schooling, self-educated in the School of Hard Knocks, Lincoln would astound the world by the keenness of his intellect and the power of his oratory. In 1860, New York Republican Party leaders invited him to give a speech on slavery to an elite audience. A newspaper report said they were startled by the poorly dressed, ugly man from the West. He stunned the audience with the most brilliant political speech they had ever heard. And the Gettysburg Address became the most quoted speech in American history and has been described as the decisive turning point in the war. In the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania, 23,000 Union soldiers and about an equal number of Confederates on the Confederate side had been killed. At the ceremony dedicating Gettysburg National Cemetery, the first speaker was the famous orator and one-time president of Harvard University, Edward Everett. He spoke for 2 hours. Lincoln was next and spoke for 2 minutes. Yet his speech lives on and is still ranked among the 3 greatest speeches of all time. In his law practice and in his presidency, Lincoln would go fast or he would go slow, but his aim was to not go wrong. As an attorney, he didn't accept all cases. On one occasion, he said to a potential client, "We could get you your $600, but I think the lady and her children need it more." The potential client interjected, "But isn't it legal?" Lincoln responded that something that's legal isn't necessarily right. Perhaps you could find another way to get $600. How did Lincoln start out on the path to becoming a lawyer, which had been his deepest dream? He and his partner were in business in a country store. They ran a country store. He did other things too. He was postmaster, he did surveying, different things. They were going broke. And Lincoln said he wouldn't mind if they could sell everything that was left, pay all their bills, and he ended up with just enough money to buy one book, Blackstone's Commentary on English Law. A family moving west came past the store and asked if he would buy a barrel of stuff off their wagon for 50 cents. The last thing Lincoln needed was a barrel of stuff. But he noticed the thin children and the pleading look on the woman's face, and he reached into his pocket for his last 50 cents. Later, he found at the bottom of the barrel that very book. Lincoln said, "I stood there holding the book and looking toward the heavens. There came a deep impression on me that God had something for me to do, and he was showing me how to get ready for it." Someone once asked why it is that people don't see God anymore as in the old days. An old rabbi replied, "Maybe they don't stoop low enough." The humble 6'4" Lincoln would stoop not to appeal to greed, but to lift up the downtrodden. As president, beyond his first duty to keep the nation together, his goal was not to help himself or his party, but to help the underdog. "Inasmuch as you have done it to one of the least of these, my brothers, you have done it to me." Sounds a lot like Murray Missions, Casey's program, breakfast program, and so on. Many Republicans saw slavery as a moral issue and wanted immediate abolition. Many Democrats saw it as an economic issue and wanted each new state coming into the Union to have the right to vote to decide whether to be slave or free. Lincoln was in the middle. He saw slavery as a moral question, but with economic and national unity overtones. Lincoln had been an expert with an axe, and he could split apart falsehood from truth. Democracy implies freedom, but he knew that you couldn't put an equal sign between freedom and slavery, as the Democrat Stephen Douglas and his popular sovereignty platform implied you could. He could see that under the guise of democracy, adding more slave states would only divide the country more. He knew a democracy does not guarantee a decision that is right. Later, Hitler in Germany would come to power democratically. States' rights did not guarantee human rights. And how could a country existing on the backs of slaves who had no freedom be free and united? He once asked, "How many legs does a dog have if you call the tail a leg?" 4. Calling the tail a leg doesn't make it a leg. He said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I do not expect the house to fall, and I do not expect it to remain divided." He proposed 3 steps. 1, to acknowledge that in the Constitution, slavery in the southern states was legal. 2, to make the spread of slavery illegal. And 3, to pay the new border states coming into the Union to free all their slaves. He believed that by these means, slavery would eventually become extinct. It did disappear much more quickly than he had any right to expect. By events set in motion when the rebelling southern states took the first shot on Fort Sumter in South Carolina that started the awful Civil War. Once the separatist states took that shot, Democrat Stephen Douglas, who had defeated Lincoln in the Illinois Senate race, and whom Lincoln had defeated in the presidential race, came to the support of Lincoln and the Union cause immediately. Jefferson Davis, the President of the Confederate States of America, had been clearly warned by his own best advisors. They said to him, "Don't shoot first. If war comes," they said, "slavery goes." For Lincoln had made his position clear. "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war. You can have no conflict without being yourselves the aggressors. You have no oath registered in heaven to destroy the government, while I have the most solemn one to preserve, protect, and defend it." Is it not ironic that to save the very life of the nation he had sworn to protect, Lincoln, who would not hunt or fish even to provide food, had to sacrifice precious human lives? Is it not ironic that he, the most sane of men, whose favorite recreation, second only to storytelling to give others pleasure, was the theater, in a theater should lose his life? Shot in the back of the head at point-blank range on Good Friday by a hateful, racist actor, all because the president would pursue voting rights for blacks. Loyal as he was to the Declaration of Independence, of which he spoke in the Gettysburg Address, 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Is it not ironic that Jefferson Davis would say on Lincoln's death, "Next to the destruction of the Confederacy, the death of Abraham Lincoln is the darkest day the South has ever known"? Once joined in life, the private and the president were joined in death. One fell asleep doing guard watch for a friend. The other would stay up late, secretly plotting mercy and healing and unity for friend and foe and federal union alike. For both, life had been an arduous march, suddenly ended. I think of his kind face, and I thank him again.